Everything they told you about what a real shelter looks like is wrong. Not wrong in a small way, wrong in a way that cost entire ranching dynasties everything they had ever built. The winter of 1886 swept across the northern Great Plains like a verdict and erased from the map every man who had laughed at one rancher's unconventional idea. While cattle barons with hundreds of thousands of animals watched their herds freeze solid in open fields, one man's structure, a patchwork frame of timber poles and stretched canvas, pressed hard into a hillside hollow, stood completely unmoved through temperatures that plunged to 46 degrees below zero. They had laughed at him all summer long. They called his construction a fool's shelter. By the time the spring thaw finally arrived in 1887, it was the only thing still standing on that stretch of frozen Montana ground. His name was Elias Harlan. He was not a cattle king. He was not a man whose name appeared in any territorial newspaper or whose opinion anyone thought worth soliciting. He ran a modest outfit on the eastern slope of a low ridgeline in Montana's Judith Basin. Maybe 300 head of cattle, a small flock of sheep, 2 horses he trusted with his life, and 1 old mule he did not. He had arrived from Kentucky 8 years earlier with no particular plan beyond outrunning a life that had stopped fitting him. And he had stayed because the land, for all its punishment, asked nothing of him except honesty. What he built that summer of 1886 was not a barn in any conventional sense. The other ranchers in the basin, men with real money, men who had been working the northern range since before the northern Pacific drove its rails through, had barns made of hauled lumber, straight-sided and proud. Elias couldn't afford that, so he did something different. He dug into the face of a south-facing hill, cutting back the earth roughly 12 feet into the slope. He built a rough timber frame over the opening, cross-braced with pine he dragged down from the ridge. Then he stretched canvas over it, heavy wagon canvas, doubled in 2 sheets with a deliberate gap between them, weighted the windward sides with cut sod, and banked packed earth hard against the base. He stuffed the gap between the canvas layers with dried grass and loose sheep wool. The whole thing looked, to every man who rode past it, like something a child might assemble on a rainy afternoon. One rancher, a man named Caldwell, who ran 8,000 head and considered himself the authority on most things in the basin, pulled up his horse one afternoon in August and stared at the structure for a long moment. "That thing will blow to pieces in the first hard norther," he said. He did not lower his voice. "You built yourself a fool's shelter, Harlan." So, what happened when the hardest winter in the recorded history of the Northern Plains finally arrived? And what did this one quiet rancher understand? About cold, about shelter, about the physics of survival, that every wealthy cattle king in that basin had completely and catastrophically missed. Before we get into that, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever been told you were doing something wrong by someone with more money and more confidence than you, only to find out later that you were the one who actually had it right? Leave your answer in the comments below, because what you are about to learn about how shelter actually works, and how almost everything the modern world taught you about staying warm is quietly backwards, is going to change the way you think about preparation, survival, and conventional wisdom for good. Here is what we have all been trained to believe about protection from the cold. You need thick walls. You need engineered materials. You need factory-produced insulation, foam boards, spray polyurethane, reflective radiant barriers. You need a system designed by professionals using industrial inputs that cost more per square foot than Elias Harlan earned in a full season. The modern cold weather building industry will sell you an R value printed on a label and tell you that number means you're protected. It doesn't, because that number reflects laboratory conditions. It does not account for what happens when a 40-mile-per-hour Montana wind strips the thermal boundary layer off your wall and negative 40-degree air starts probing every seam your contractor assured you was sealed. Now compare that with what Elias built. No engineered foam, no spray application, no rating system, just canvas, wool, dried grass, earth, and geometry. 2 canvas layers separated by an air gap, backed by a hillside that had never, in the memory of the ground beneath it, dropped below freezing on its interior. Each layer reinforced the last. It was not a product. It was a system. And here is where it gets worse for the modern approach. The thin-walled, metal-sided prefab structures that dominate ranching operations across the plains today conduct cold the way a radiator conducts heat. Metal does not trap air, it bridges the thermal gap. It pulls warmth out of the interior and hands it directly to the wind waiting outside. Elias's canvas and earth and wool did the exact opposite. It hoarded warmth. It fought the cold from three directions at once. Here is the part that should make you quietly furious. The men who laughed at Elias that summer were not stupid. They were operating according to the logic of the open-range cattle industry, a logic handed to them by Eastern investors who had financed the whole operation, and by a press that described the northern plains as an inexhaustible pasture where cattle could winter on open ground and emerge fat in spring. Scottish and English investment syndicates had read reports written by men who had never spent a January in the Judith Basin, claiming the climate was moderate, the grass nutritious, and the cattle entirely self-sufficient. They believed it because believing it was profitable. They passed that belief down to every man working their land. Elias didn't have investors. He had winters. He had watched in his first year a neighbor's calf freeze to death standing upright in a November storm. He had felt the wind come down off the high woods in January and understood in his body, not his ledger, what it meant. He built what he built because the land had educated him. The cattle barons built what they built because their accounts had educated them. The accounts were wrong, and the system that replaced preparation with scale and shelter with open range did not die with the winter of 1886. It passed itself forward. Today, the solution offered to anyone struggling with cold is still always another product, another upgrade, another industrial input, never the patient, unglamorous work of understanding heat itself. That is not your failure. You were given broken instructions by people who profited from the complexity. Canvas does something that rigid modern materials cannot do. It breathes in the truest sense. A tightly woven canvas fabric allows minute amounts of moisture vapor to pass through while blocking liquid water, and critically, blocking wind entirely under tension. And wind is the real enemy of warmth on the open plains. Think of warmth as a crowd of people packed tightly into a small room. They generate heat collectively, and the room stays warm. Wind is the door that keeps slamming open and emptying that room with every gust. Canvas, properly tensioned and without gaps, holds that door shut with remarkable authority. That means the air immediately against the interior wall stays still. And still air is the single most effective insulator that basic physics offers. Think of a down sleeping bag. It does not keep you warm because of the feathers. It keeps you warm because of the air. The feathers hold perfectly motionless. The feathers are just the architecture. Elias's doubled canvas was doing exactly the same thing on a structural scale, holding a layer of air in place and preventing the wind from displacing it. But Elias didn't stop at one layer. He used two sheets of canvas separated by a deliberate gap, stuffed with dried grass and loose wool. That gap, what building science today calls a dead airspace with organic infill, meant the cold had to defeat not one thermal barrier, but three. First canvas layer, wool and grass infill. Second canvas layer, each one demanding that the cold give up energy to cross it. By the time temperatures outside were at 46 below, the inside of that structure was measuring something closer to the low 20s. Cold, yes, but survivable for animals generating their own body heat, not 46 below zero. That is not a small distinction. That is the difference between a live animal and a carcass. Here is what this means for you. Every principle at work in that canvas wall has been formalized into modern building code, dead air spaces, thermal breaks, vapor barriers. They are all just rediscovered versions of what Elias assembled from instinct and necessity. The knowledge was never invented. It was always there. It was just never profitable to teach you the source. The hillside was not a backdrop to Elias's shelter. It was the shelter's engine. Below the frost line, and even in a brutal Montana winter, the frost rarely penetrates beyond 4 or 5 feet. The earth maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round, typically somewhere between 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit at depth, depending on location and season. By cutting 12 feet into the slope, Elias surrounded 3 of his 4 walls and most of his floor with that thermal reservoir. The earth did not generate heat. It stored heat, like a battery that had been quietly charging since July, and it released that stored warmth slowly slowly, continuously, and passively into the interior air without consuming a single cord of wood. Think of it this way. A root cellar never freezes and never boils because the earth around it is doing all the thermal regulating. Elias just scaled that principle up and put animals in it. Then he added the body heat those animals produce themselves. A resting cow generates roughly the equivalent of a small electric space heater, around 500 watts of heat at rest. Pack 30 cattle into a partially subterranean, insulated canvas structure on a brutal Montana night, and the math starts working in your favor in a way no thin-walled steel barn can match. The animals heated the space, the earth held the warmth in, the canvas blocked the wind from stealing it, and the whole thing ran on no fuel whatsoever. This is the kind of thinking the industrial age trained us to forget, not because the knowledge became obsolete, because it became unsellable. Elias positioned the open face of his shelter toward the south. This was not incidental. It was the same orientation practiced by Native American peoples across the plains for generations, refined by Mongolian herders over centuries of pastoral experience, and documented across virtually every pre-industrial culture that built shelter in cold northern climates. South-facing structures on the northern plains receive direct winter sunlight at precisely the angle that matters most. The winter sun sits low on the horizon, driving its light nearly horizontally into a south-facing opening. That light strikes the earthen floor and the dark interior walls. It converts to heat, and the thermal mass, all that earth, absorbs it and holds it for hours after the sun moves on. Meanwhile, the dominant wind on the northern plains flows from the north and northwest. By pressing his back wall completely into the hillside, Elias eliminated the windward face of his structure entirely. The north wall was a Montana hillside. It did not exist as a heat loss surface because it did not exist as a surface at all. You cannot lose warmth through a wall that the wind cannot find. If you're feeling a slow, frustrated recognition building right now, a sense that this is obvious, that it should have been taught, that someone chose not to teach it, that feeling is justified, these principles were available. They were never lost. They were just commercially inconvenient. The winter arrived in November, and it did not meaningfully relent until March. Temperatures across the northern plains dropped to documented lows of 46 degrees below zero. A thick ice crust locked over the grass across millions of acres, sealing the forage beneath it. The cattle pawed at the crust until their hooves bled, then gave up. Snow buried them where they stood. By the most conservative documented estimates, roughly 362,000 cattle perished in Montana alone. On some stretches of the Judith Basin, a rider could travel for miles stepping from frozen carcass to frozen carcass without touching open ground. The number of large-scale cattle companies operating in Colorado collapsed from 58 in 1885 to just 9 by 1888. Theodore Roosevelt quit the ranching business entirely, writing that the losses had been crippling and that he never recovered his investment. Charlie Russell, the artist who would come to define the mythology of the West, painted a single emaciated steer, ribs showing, standing alone in a snowdrift while wolves circled at the edge. He sent it in a letter to a ranch manager who had asked how the cattle were doing. He titled it Waiting for a Chinook. It required no explanation. Elias Harlan lost 11 animals that winter. Out of 300, less than 4%. His sheep, sheltered in a secondary canvas lean-to attached to the main structure, lost 2 animals to an illness entirely unrelated to cold. His horses were unhurt. In the spring, when the ranchers who had survived, many of them financially shattered, most of them permanently altered, rode the basin to take stock of the damage, they came across Elias's outfit still intact. The canvas was weather-stained but unbroken. The animals were thin but standing. The structure had not moved. Caldwell, who had lost more than 60% of his 8,000 head, sat on his horse for a long time looking at it. He did not say anything. If this is changing how you see preparation, if you're starting to feel the gap between what we're sold and what actually works, hit like, because we're just getting to the part that tells you what to do about it. After the winter of 1886 to 87, the open range era effectively ended. The industry that replaced it adopted some lessons: fenced pastures, hay operations, rudimentary barns. But the specific knowledge of how to build shelter with what the land offered, how to use canvas and earth and geometry to create warmth without industrial inputs, how to think about a shelter as an integrated system rather than a manufactured product, so that Knowledge quietly drifted into the territory of the quaint and the obsolete. Three forces drove it out. Speed first. Even a chastened cattle industry needed to rebuild quickly and at scale. Techniques that required local observation, terrain reading, and a season's patience could not be packaged and shipped to 100 ranches simultaneously. Standardized lumber kits could be cost structure second, prefabricated barn components, corrugated metal, standard lumber, bolt together frames could be priced, financed, delivered by rail, and billed to an account. A technique that used hillside earth and layered canvas generated no transaction. Systems that generate no transactions get quietly erased just from the instruction manual. And cheap energy third. When coal furnaces and then natural gas heating reached the plains in the early 20th century, the incentive to build thermally intelligent structures vanished almost entirely. Why master the geometry of your walls when you can simply burn more fuel? That logic held as long as fuel stayed cheap and infrastructure stayed intact. The hidden cost was a civilization of structures that cannot sustain themselves without continuous mechanical intervention. Pull the power, cut the gas, and the building fails within hours. Elias's canvas shelter had no such dependency. It was a system, not a subscription. So, what do you actually do with this? You do not need to dig into a hillside, but you can put every principle Elias used to work today. The first and easiest thing, evaluate your existing cold weather structure for wind penetration before you evaluate it for insulation. Walk the perimeter in a moderate wind. Run your hand along every corner, every eave, every gap where a pipe or wire penetrates the wall. Feel where the air is moving. Seal those points first. A gap the width of a pencil at a corner joint destroys the value of every dollar of insulation inside that wall. Stop the wind first, and the air inside begins to hold its own warmth. That costs almost nothing. The second, for anyone building or retrofitting, bank the north wall, pack earth against it, stack hay bales tight against it, pile cordwood against it. Anything with thermal mass and the capacity to hold still air becomes a passive insulation layer. Combine that with a south-facing primary opening and any form of organic dead air infill, straw packed between two sheets of plywood, wool bats, even dried leaves in a pinch. And you have replicated the core architecture of what Elias built, using whatever your immediate landscape offers. And the minimum, the thing anyone can do right now, block the base. Cold air is heavy. It sinks and it moves along the ground. A 6-inch gap under a barn wall or door bleeds warmth faster than a 6-foot gap at the roofline. Bank the base of any structure you care about keeping warm. That single action, the same thing Elias did when he packed earth hard against the base of his canvas. Walls costs nothing and works every time. Elias Harlan was not a primitive man making do with inferior materials. He was an engineer of the land itself, someone who had listened to the cold long enough to understand its logic, and then built a precise, layered response to that logic out of what the earth and the canvas and the geometry of the hill made available to him. The knowledge wasn't lost. It was laughed at, and then it was left behind the moment it stopped being profitable to teach. We are here to dig up exactly this kind of knowledge, the practices, the principles, the systems that the modern world traded away for convenience, and then blamed you for the consequences. If this changed how you see shelter, how you see preparation, how you see the gap between what we are sold and what actually works, subscribe, because we have only just started pulling at this thread. And tell us in the comments, what forgotten knowledge do you want us to investigate next? What abandoned practice, what overlooked system, what thing the industry told you was obsolete do you want us to bring back into the light?